Hello, welcome to June. Welcome back to my channel. I don't know where the time has gone, but it feels like I just filmed my April wrap-up and now I'm already back to put a bow on May. In that April wrap-up video, I was talking about how busy I was in April, and luckily that busy period has started to cool off in May. And in terms of my reading life, I'm continuing to read more and more lately. I finished 9 books in May, which is quite a lot compared to my average of 5 or 6. Granted, 3 or 4 of those were novellas, but I still feel like I'm stretching my ability to process my feelings about each book and write reviews for them in a timely manner. So I'm looking forward to June being a period to regroup, recalibrate, relax, drink water, moisturize. That said, let's reflect on what I read and watched in May, starting with some of the novellas I read. So in the first half of May, I finished the second and third novellas in the Murderbot Diaries series by Martha Wells. Artificial Condition is book 2 and Rogue Protocol is book 3, and I'm still really enjoying them. I think I've given all of the books in the series 4 stars so far. If you're not familiar with Murderbot, it follows a security unit construct that has overridden its governor module, the software that compels it to obey orders, and just like the rest of us, it realizes that while it's technically free to do what it wants, there will be consequences when the people in charge realize that it can disobey orders. Each novella so far follows a pretty similar template. Murderbot gets entangled in some way with a group of well-meaning humans who need his protection. It attempts to solve some mystery, and it escalates into an action sequence. It's fun, it's funny, it's pretty lighthearted for the most part, but within that, Murderbot being a security unit who has gone rogue and is trying to pass as human and figure out what freedom means to it, has a lot of narrative and allegorical symbolic depth that I think is developing really nicely. The first 4 episodes of the new Murderbot TV series on Apple TV also dropped this month, with Alexander Skarsgård playing Murderbot, and I'm liking that series so far as well. The TV series is adapting the first novella, All Systems Red, into 10 22-ish minute episodes, and I was kind of curious how they were going to stretch this novella into that many episodes, since it's not a very long book. And the framing device is that this is a diary. It's primarily internal monologue. But I think they've done well with the adaptation so far. It feels, in my opinion, really faithful in tone and in spirit. I think they've externalized the things that make sense to externalize from his internal monologue. And I can see where the budget might have constrained their adaptation of certain things with the action scenes, and how Murderbot doesn't have a ton of visible mechanical pieces on his body. But I think so far they've done really well within like the parameters that they need to operate in. I'm being a little bit cautious of reading too many reactions and reviews of the show because I want to avoid spoilers for the rest of the series. But the one thing I did see complaints about on the Murderbot subreddit was the rigid network format in a show distributed by a premium streaming service. The episodes, like I said, are about 22 minutes long, and they're being released 1 week at a time. And I've seen frustration around the slow drip of content and how lacking like each individual episode seems to be in material. I haven't personally felt this frustration, but I do prefer a serialized release format to like the more modern dump all the episodes at once and binge them format. But I do understand that sentiment as part of a larger consequence of stretching not very much source material into 10 episodes. I don't know. If you've been watching this series, let me know your thoughts in the comments. But staying in the sci-fi fantasy space, I read 2 great fantasy novels this month: The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin and The Daughter's War by Christopher Buehlman. I'm going to give a summary of my thoughts on these now, But I am also planning a video in June where I provide an update on my fantasy bingo board progress, and I want to do a bit more of a deep dive into how the world building is approached in these books and the elements and the shorthand they're including to add depth and realism to the world building, because I think they are both doing this really well in their own ways. The first book I finished was The Daughter's War. This is a prequel to The Black Tongue Thief, but is self-contained enough that it could probably stand on its own if for some reason someone wanted to start with this one. The primary supporting character in The Black Tongue Thief is Galva, a knight and veteran of the Goblin Wars, and this book follows Galva's story as a 20-year-old going to war in this special all-women unit where they command these magically modified war corvids. And whereas The Black Tongue Thief described the world through the lens of this criminal underbelly and had a relatively classic D&D feeling and D&D adventure structure, The Daughter's War describes the world through the lens of the military and this terrifying goblin invasion. It's called The Daughter's War because there were 2 previous goblin invasions that resulted in a scarcity of able-bodied men. But Galva has 3 brothers that are all involved in the war effort in some way, and I feel that this book is primarily structured around her relationship to them. But it's also about her relationship to her corvids and her fellow soldiers. It's about her relationship to her country and her religion and her sexuality. She gradually has these realizations about her sexuality as a lesbian, and I feel like a lesbian written by a man has the potential to be icky, but this did not feel icky to me. It was really well done. There is magic, but it's not a very deeply explained magic system. Buehlman focuses a lot more on the personal and the familial and the cultural. And also the goblins are scary as shit in this series. Do be warned if you go to read it. They do very gruesome things to humans, but I would recommend this book to anyone that likes dark fantasy. Moving on, I also gave The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin 5 stars. It feels like everyone but me already read this or at least knew about it, but if you, like me, are late on this one, it is fundamentally an X-Men type premise. This book takes place on a planet with a lot of seismic activity where earthquakes and volcanic eruptions make life on this planet really tough. Luckily, we have mutants called Origines who can manipulate the Earth to ease this seismic activity. Unfortunately, these mutants are also pretty dangerous to other humans. So, good thing, civilization has developed a system to train and control them so that their powers can be used for the good of society. Like X-Men, this concept provides an analog to real-world prejudices and systemic oppression. Also, like X-Men, it's not a one-to-one analog to real-world prejudices because these mutants are genuinely categorically different and objectively dangerous. But what the 5th season critiques very clearly is the commodification of bodies for empire under the guise of necessity. I thought Jemisin really thought out the world building here through an anthropological lens in a way that kind of reminds me of Ursula K. Le Guin, and it thinks through the logical consequences of how power is structured and how historical and cultural knowledge gets disseminated. If you haven't read this already, if you like fantasy that explores systems of oppression, the rise and fall of empire, do check this one out, and I'm looking forward to reading more. An interesting framing device in the 5th season is the expanding of scope to look at human civilization through a geological time frame. The narrative talks about not only how this particular empire came to power centuries previously and how it's maintained power through that length of time, but it also gestures towards the existence of long-dead civilizations on this planet and to other non-human sentient species. And Under the Eye of the Big Bird by Hiromi Kawakami, which I picked up for my International Booker Prize reading, also considers the evolution of human civilization as well as the human species over a very long time frame. We're talking about millennia. And this is a novel told through a series of interconnected short stories about humanity on the brink of extinction and what it means to try to preserve the human species. It explores the use of bioengineering and cloning and interspecies splicing and AI, but it's a soft sci-fi book that is really asking us to think about what it means to be human and what it means to preserve the human species and the role of change in preservation. This is not going to be a book for everyone. It is very strange and philosophical and told in a non-linear fashion that is pretty disorienting, but it was very thought-provoking. The other International Booker book I read was Small Boat by Vincent Delcroix. This is a novel based on a real event in which a small boat filled with refugees sank as they were trying to cross the English Channel from France to England, and it resulted in the deaths of 27 refugees. This novel is a fictionalization of that tragedy, primarily told through the point of view of the French woman in the French Sea Rescue Office who fielded the distress calls from the boat as it was sinking, and she did not send a French boat to their aid. The first section of the book takes place in the aftermath, describing an interview between the phone operator and a police inspector as they're doing an official investigation into the event and whether there was negligence or a failure of judgment. This was obviously a very challenging read, but it was extremely gripping and probably one of the most important things I've read so far this year. I have 3 books remaining that I read in May, 1 that I loved and 2 that I thought were okay. Raising Hare by Chloe Dalton was a pleasant read, but it didn't quite match what I wanted from it. This is a memoir about Dalton's journey raising an abandoned baby hare in the English countryside during COVID lockdown era. It contains nature writing and Dalton's reflections on the hare as a wild animal rather than a domesticated animal. It contains Dalton's research on hares and how they've been treated in hunting and food and art throughout history. And it contains memoir as she grows in her appreciation for the natural world and the tension between her high travel job and her desire to stay settled. I don't necessarily want to turn anyone else away from reading this if it interests you. It was cozy and it provided, contemplation of the natural world that I think a lot of people would enjoy. But I found it a little boring, to be honest, especially in the beginning when she's talking about hares throughout history and 18th century poetry about hares. It felt like a Wikipedia deep dive, which I could see would appeal to some people, but it's just not what I wanted from a memoir. Next, Fire Exit by Morgan Talty was another book that was good, but I just didn't connect with very strongly. The main character of this book is a white man named Charles who grew up on the Penobscot Indian Reservation in Maine because his mother married in, but he was required to move off the reservation as a young man because he has no Penobscot blood, so he lives in a house that his stepfather helped him build across the river from the reservation. A further loss for him is that his native girlfriend, Mary, became pregnant with his child, but chose to raise this child with a native man so that the child could be counted in the census as Penobscot. And in this book, their daughter is an adult now, but they're estranged. His daughter does not know Charles, does not know he's her father, and Charles wants his daughter to know the truth. Also central to the story is Charles's relationship with his mother, who is suffering from dementia. This is a character book. It's a book about family bonds and blood and belonging. I did enjoy the prose and the questions raised by this premise, but I think where it fell flat for me is how the book primarily takes place in this contemplative holding pattern, but I needed more tension. The final book I read this month was The Dream Hotel by Laila Lalami, and this was another speculative fiction banger. The premise of this one is that after one mass shooting too many, the US Congress has passed a bill that gives authorities access to identify, by means of sophisticated algorithms, people who are likely to commit violent crimes and detain them. Our main character, Sarah, is a museum archivist that is flagged for having a high risk score when she's returning from a work trip abroad. And she's then put into a retention center for a minimum of 21 days so that she can be observed until she is no longer considered a risk to herself and others. As you might expect, she ends up being detained for much longer than 21 days. This book was really gripping to me because it does not feel very removed from our current reality at all. As a society, so much of our privacy has already been eroded for the benefit of comfort and expedience and productivity, and we on the internet are already subject to algorithms that serve to identify us and categorize us and predict our behaviors every day. The technological leap described in this book is that our main character, as a new mother, has opted to get an implant that enables her to get better, more efficient sleep, and now her dreams are an additional data point that can be used to predict her behavior. The abuse of this data is dystopian, but in a way that feels very grounded in the world we live in right now. This book is a commentary on not just technological surveillance, but for-profit prison systems, the immigrant experience, and the role of women in society. I thought this was so engaging, and I'd recommend it to anyone, really. That is all the books I read in May. I also watched 2 new movies this month. I watched Thunderbolts at the beginning of the month. I really disliked Captain America: Brave New World earlier this year, but Thunderbolts feels like a return to form for Marvel. Florence Pugh is great in the lead role, and I'm excited about this introduction to Sentry and seeing how the MCU utilizes that character in the future. I don't know that I have a ton more that's of interest to say about Marvel at the moment. It's all been said, but I enjoyed this one. The other new movie I watched this month was Friendship, which is a cringe comedy starring Tim Robinson as a socially awkward dad and white collar guy who forms a friendship with his new neighbor and local weatherman, Paul Rudd, played by Paul Rudd. I would call this a dark comedy. If you're familiar with Tim Robinson's humor, you might already have a sense of if you would like this movie or not. He is playing an awkward, intense, oblivious man archetype that is pretty familiar from his sketch comedy, but because this is a movie, you linger with this character for a lot longer, and you have more time to contemplate how deeply sad this guy is. I watched this in a small but very packed theater, and it was really quiet for most of the movie. I felt like I was the only one laughing in certain moments, and I wonder if everyone in my theater knew exactly what they were getting into. That said, I liked the movie, and I thought it provided an interesting and relevant commentary on modern masculinity and male friendships. I think generally it speaks to the difficulty of forming meaningful friendships in adulthood. And that's what I read and watched in May. I'm pretty pleased with how it went, and I'm excited for what I have planned for my reading and for the channel as we head into June as well. I am going on vacation next week. It's my birthday on Wednesday and my 10-year college reunion next week, so I don't know how much I'll actually be reading in the next week, but I am planning to record a video for my summertime goals check-in and TBR. I'm also planning to read and review some queer 2025 releases for Pride Month. For that, I'm currently reading Disappoint Me by Nicola Dinan. That is about a trans woman in her 30s who is in a new relationship with a cis man and grappling with how she feels about heteronormative domesticity. I also have The River Has Roots on hold at the library, which is a fantasy that I believe has non-binary representation. I also have Flirting Lessons on hold, which is a lesbian romance. I mentioned earlier in the video that I want to do a fantasy book bingo check-in video where I also unpack some of the world building in the books I've read for the challenge so far. I have just started to read The Sword of Kaigen explicitly for the Fantasy Book Bingo hard mode prompt to read a book where a main character that is a parent is the protagonist and their child is also a major character in the story. So once I finish The Sword of Kaigen, I will be filming that check-in video as well. So that is May wrapped up. What I hope to get to in June. I have been yapping long enough and I need to edit this video and pack for my vacation, so I'm going to end it here. Please go ahead and leave me a comment on the favorite thing you read or watched in May and what you are looking forward to in June. See you next time.